Welcome. I'm Eric Fleming, host of A Moment with Eric Fleming, the podcast of our time. I want to personally thank you for listening to the podcast. If you like what you're hearing, then I need you to do a few things. First, I need subscribers. I'm on Patreon at patreon.com/A Moment with Eric Fleming. Your subscription allows an independent podcaster like me the freedom to speak truth to power and to expand and improve the show. Second, leave a 5-star review for the podcast on the streaming service you listen to it. That will help the podcast tremendously. Third, go to the website, momenteric.com. There you can subscribe to the podcast, leave reviews and comments, listen to past episodes, and even learn a little bit about your host. Lastly, don't keep this a secret like it's your own personal guilty pleasure. Tell someone else about the podcast. Encourage others to listen to the podcast and share the podcast on your social media platforms because it is time to make this moment a movement. Thanks in advance for supporting the podcast of our time. I hope you enjoy this episode as well. Program note. This episode was recorded prior to the attempted assassination of former President Donald Trump. So I want to wish him a speedy recovery. I hope that the Republicans have a safe and productive convention in Milwaukee. And I want to emphasize to everyone listening, political violence is not acceptable. Hello, and welcome to another moment with Eric Fleming. I am your host, Eric Fleming. And today I have two guests that I think will, let's see, how do I want to say this? Enlighten you. Yeah, that's a good word. That will enlighten you with their perspectives. They have both written books, and we're going to talk about their books. And hopefully, not only will you, after hearing these interviews, buy the books, but you will get something out of the discussions that we've had with my guests that will be enlightening to you and hopeful even. So I look forward to sharing that with you. But right now, as we always do, it's time to kick off this program with a moment of news with Grace G.
Thanks, Eric. President Biden asserted in an ABC News interview that he remains the candidate to beat Donald Trump in November's election, despite concerns over his debate performance and public speaking gaffes. A Wall Street Journal poll showed 86% of Democrats would vote for Biden against Trump, a drop from 93% in February. Donald Trump distanced himself from Project 2025, the Heritage Foundation's plan for a potential future Republican presidency. U.S. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez introduced impeachment articles against Supreme Court Justices Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito. Tropical Storm Beryl caused significant destruction in southeast Texas, including fatalities, flooding, and widespread power outages. Russia launched a deadly missile attack on a children's hospital in Kiev, killing numerous civilians and causing widespread devastation. President Biden renewed his vow to support Ukraine against Russia at the NATO summit in Washington, D.C. Britain's new Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, will lead a parliament with unprecedented ethnic diversity and female representation after a decisive election victory. France faces political uncertainty after elections resulted in a hung parliament, complicating President Macron's ability to push through his agenda. The Kansas Supreme Court permanently blocked a law banning the most common second trimester abortion procedure. The Wisconsin Supreme Court overturned a previous ruling, allowing voters to return absentee ballots through drop boxes. Former NRA CFO Wilson Phillips agreed to a 10-year ban on managing New York nonprofits as part of a corruption case settlement. And despite high fuel costs and hurricane threats, nearly 71 million Americans traveled during the 4th of July holiday. I am Grace G., and this has been A Moment of News.
All right, and thank you, Grace, for that moment of news. Now it is time for my first guest, and his name is Saqib Qureshi. Saqib Qureshi is a fellow at the London School of Economics and Political Science, where he received his PhD in International Relations and Epistemology. His work has been featured in the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, and Entrepreneur. Qureshi has produced 2 films, and in 1996, the BBC One documentary Al Dawa, the first television documentary about the Muslim community in any Western country. He lives in Toronto, and his latest book is Being Muslim Today, Reclaiming the Faith from Orthodoxy and Islamophobia. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor and privilege to have as a guest on this podcast, Dr. Saqib Qureshi. All right, Saqib Qureshi. How you doing, sir? First of all, did I do okay on the name?
Yeah, pretty close, actually. It's Saqib Qureshi. Good to meet you, Eric.
Saqib. Okay. Saqib Qureshi. All right. All right, doctor. I appreciate you coming on, man. You've written this book, and I want to get into the reasons why you wrote this book. And the book is called Being Muslim Today, Reclaiming the Faith from Orthodoxy and Islamophobia. So what I normally do with guests is I give them a quote and let them respond to it. And your quote is, "The system will collapse if we refuse to buy what they are selling. Their ideas, their version of history, their weapons, their notions of inevitability. Remember this, we be many and they be few. They need us more than we need them. Another world is not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing." What does that quote mean to you?
More than anything else, I think it's the realization that the Muslim voice, which has been muffled for so long, which doesn't have an expression even in Muslim majority countries. Forget in non-Muslim majority countries, that voice is becoming more and more heard. The internet is a fantastic platform for that, and Muslims of America, of Canada, of the UK, France, other Western countries, Muslims of those countries are beginning to find their voice. They are beginning to push back against some of the narratives that are imposed upon them, against them. And I'm happy to be part of that inflection point where we are finding our feet and we are now beginning to make our case, and we are pushing back, and we are, we're hurt, desperately hurt, particularly by the events in Gaza and the ongoing events over the last many generations in Palestine, but other events as well, just the discrimination against Muslim people and airports, in the media in particular, particularly the Western media, So we're pushing back, and that to me is what that quote really means.
Yeah, so I'm going to get into some of the kind of the events, that's going on that impacts the community. But I want to kind of get into the book first. You start the book as far as the chapters part with a question that your teenage son asked you. Could you tell the audience what that question was, how you felt when he asked you that question, and how exactly did you answer the question?
So the question that he asked me on a Saturday morning while I'm watching a game of soccer, as you call it in the US, was, Papa, is Islam a violent religion? And my instant reaction, my gut reaction, my instinctive reaction was, stop bothering me with stupid questions. I'm watching a game of football. That was, I didn't say it, but I can tell you that's what I felt. And I began,
Right.
and I turned away from him, and then I turned back to look at him, and I could see he was being dead serious. And there was this kind of shock and horror that I felt. I dragged myself away from the TV screen. I went to my own library to see if there's any material that I could give to him that could navigate his question. And I realized there wasn't, because everything I had was generally far too academic, too difficult, cumbersome for a 15-year-old to get their head around. So then I went to Amazon.com, because my son's a vociferous reader. He likes reading. So I went to Amazon and I went to a few other book websites to look for a book that was accessible but rigorous. It didn't have propaganda to it. Was like relied on the latest academic research, but was easy to read. And I found nothing. And that was my moment of kind of saying, hang on a minute, we've got a real problem here. Because everything out there is either essentially trying to sell stuff, or it's trying to push a very, very kind of academic approach, which is fine for a scholarship community of PhDs and MPhils and professors, but it's not great for the vast majority of people who don't have that kind of qualification and don't really have the time to go around pursuing it either. And so that thus began my journey for this book.
So in the introduction to the book, you said that prejudice against Black people gets challenged by global campaigns. Against Jews, it invites accusations of anti-Semitism. Prejudice against Muslims, in contrast, is acceptable at the dinner table. Why do you think that is? Because, when you were explaining the quote, you were saying that this is a time for people in the Muslim community to really express their voice. Do you not feel, well, I asked you why do you think that is, but to kind of put some nuance in it for me, do you think that it is starting to change, or it's still pretty status quo that other people's concerns seem to be, or other attacks on people seem to be responded to better than what happens to the Muslim community?
I think it's still fair game to discriminate against Muslims in political and social universes. So politicians openly do it, and they are assisted by media which is hell-bent on making the relationship between Islam and Muslims on the one hand and violence and bigotry on the other hand. So that's ongoing. I think what's changing now is that there are an increasing number of American-born Muslims, British-born Muslims, Canadian-born Muslims who deeply identify with their country and also identify with their religious identity, and their appetite to sit there essentially being told a bunch of nonsense about their faith and what it means is quite limited. Like, I don't really have much patience for these polemics. I remember having a conversation with a taxi driver in the US quite recently who asked me, is it not incumbent on all Muslims to convert all non-Muslims or kill them. And I mean, probably the last time he's going to ask that kind of question in his life. I mean, not that I was difficult or hard, but I kind of outlined the entire universe, and he was pretty shocked. Whereas I think 20, 30 years ago, there might well have been a bit more reluctance amongst American or British or Canadian-born Muslims or Western-born Muslims to kind of assert themselves. I think that's changing. And you've got popular figures out there like Mehdi Hassan, for instance, Baroness Warsi in the UK, just a few examples, people who are speaking their mind. And I think that's changing. But I still, there's no doubt in my mind that discrimination against Muslims is very, very present. And part of that is there's a political agenda for it, because if you discriminate against Muslim populations, then you're able to exercise more control over certain parts of the world by kind of saying, well, ignore the Muslim voice there, ignore the Muslim voice in our country, let's just continue doing what we're doing.
So what is it like? Well, first of all, what is Islam to you? What does the religion mean to you? And what is it like being a Muslim, a practitioner of the religion in Western culture?
So Islam to me is the belief in one God, and only one God, and the worship of that one God, and that God asking of us to lead good lives and avoid bad things, and then be individually accountable after we pass away on the day of judgment and being rewarded with heaven or hell. That's very, very simple. The caveats I now issue to that is that there's absolutely no forced conversion, number one. Number two, there's absolutely no signs of a forced conversion. Number two, there's a very, very strong anti-violence streak to Islam, at least the one that I've understood. So there's that. Now, in answer to your question, what's it like to be a Muslim today, title of the book, tough work. It is very, very tough work. You have to continuously explain yourself every single time a Muslim out there in the world, and there are about, a couple of billion, every single time they do something nefarious, the entire 2 billion community gets blamed for it. Because that person's religious identity is brought to the fore, especially if it's in the United States. Like a Muslim who kills 5 people, goes on a nutcase job, his religious identity will be seized very quickly. Whereas if he was Jewish or he was Christian or he was Hindu or atheist, none of that would matter, which is ironic because the greatest genocides in the history of our species do not have Muslim fingerprints to them. Homicide per capita rates in Muslim-majority countries are lower than they are in non-Muslim majority countries. And yet, every single time there is a Muslim who's at the helm of some violent act, particularly in the United States, but also in Canada and in the UK, you'll see again and again and again the religious identity is brought to the fore as relevant or as an explanation. And for that reason, we get hammered. And we go through this cycle again and again and again. And we are pushing back. I think the Muslim community of the West is pushing back, and we're not aliens to this community. We have, to these countries. We've been in the UK for centuries. We've been in the US for centuries, and we're pushing back, and I think it's a really healthy thing.
Yeah. So that leads me to this question. In the book, you have a picture of the statue of King Richard the Lionheart that stands in front of Parliament. Talk about the significance of that statue as far as you interpret it.
So King Richard III, King of England, who really couldn't speak very much English as it happens, he was French speaking. He kills 3,000 civilians in a day in 1187, and yet there's a statue of him erected in front of the House of Commons, in front of the Parliament building, a massive statue. Bin Laden kills 3,000 people on the attacks in 9/11, and yet the treatment of the two, is profoundly different. One person is celebrated for killing 3,000 innocent people in a day, and another person is vilified. And what's at heart, what is the major difference here is the religious identity of the perpetrator. Fundamentally, if you are Christian and you kill 3,000 innocent people, okay, you could be in line for a wonderful statue in front of the British Parliament. If your religious identity is Muslim, well, not only are we going to vilify you, rightly so as it happens, I think, but we're going to vilify the billion plus Muslims at the time who are alive, 1.5 billion other Muslims, and we're going to subject them to all sorts of security checks and bank checks and airport checks, and we're going to vilify the entire 1,500 million Muslim people. And I find that, obviously disturbing and nauseous, but I think so do many other people. And it's not just myself, it's a lot of people, fortunately, are able to raise their voice and say, I'm sorry, but, we are as human as each and every other person, irrespective of gender or ethnicity or religious identity or height or skin color or profession. We are fundamentally all human beings, and our religious identity doesn't compromise that. And what's more important is that if you begin to kind of probe under the bonnet, you'll see this pot calling the kettle black so frequently that it's kind of hard to get your head around.
Yeah, and so, and the other thing, you use the term civilians, but the majority, if not all, of the victims of that massacre that King Richard inflicted were of the Muslim community. Is that not what I read?
There were Muslims and Jews, because this was part of the Crusades, and so Jewish people and other non-Muslim people have traditionally found a safe haven in Muslim countries, and that's been very much the case since the beginning of the religion. I'm not saying that Muslims have been always perfect and always peace-loving, but generally speaking, over the last 1,400 years, this is a religious identity which has embraced pluralism, and the people who died at the hands of Richard III were mostly Muslims, and you had a small minority of Jewish people as well.
Yeah, and so that kind of adds to the irony you're talking about, where, as you say, somebody Christian is given this honor and this place of nobility in history, whereas, like you said, if somebody from the Muslim community did it, it's like, they're the most evil person, and anybody associated with that person is going to be vilified.
Yes.
Which leads to this question. You have 2 chapters in the book dedicated to the competition to define Islam. Why did you feel that was important to dedicate that much time in discussing that?
Because there is huge pressure on Muslims from stakeholders from different parts of the universe to push them into certain interpretations of Islam. And this is really my problem with both orthodoxy and Islamophobia. The Orthodox community has a particular narrative, a particular story, a particular understanding of the past, which it imposes and it pushes at you. And if you don't agree to it, then Islamic Orthodoxy turns around firstly and says, well, you know what, all the scholars in the history of the religion have all agreed this point that you are debating against. And so they try that, and that fails. Well, it should fail, but unfortunately not. It actually succeeds because most people don't realize that all of the scholars in the history of Islam have agreed on diddly squat. But that's the first argument. And the second argument is, well, if you continue thinking what you're thinking, that's really dangerous. So you've got to be very careful now. If I were you, I'd stop, because you're being very dangerous here. And so you have that tool which Orthodoxy deploys in order to tell Muslims what to believe, what their religion is about, and what they can and cannot do. And at the same time, you've got the Islamophobic community, which is hell-bent on telling Muslims, you're a violent lot, you're a bit wacko, you discriminate against women until the cows come home, okay? there's something weird about you, And so you've got these two communities out there, and I think it's important for individual Muslim people to have the freedom to breathe. Like, I'm not saying that they've got to reject each and every strand of what's being told to them, but they need to have that freedom to think and breathe and engage material without fear. And we don't have that space. We simply don't have that space. And so this book is in some measure a tool to let Muslim people breathe their religion, like actually have a serious discussion around, okay, what on earth is this about? What do we know about this religion? How do we know it? With what level of certainty? What's the evidence that we have with respect to this? How did the religion change? All of that is new to most Muslim people. It's not new to scholarship. Scholarship has got reasonably good answers, robust answers, but that material doesn't percolate. And this is really another kind of important part of this book, which is to help the transition of highly academic, dense, difficult, monosyllabic, technical terms into an accessible, easy read. I mean, I'm hoping that when you read it, you didn't find it to be a laborious exercise which ought to be shifted out to a bunch of PhD students, And so, and so it's meant to be something that you can enjoy reading.
Yeah. So I take it that was the goal of the book, was to kind of, in a non, as you say, academic way, break down what the faith is. Is your target audience both the Muslim community and the non-Muslim community, or is this supposed to be for people like me that don't practice the religion?
I think this is a book for people who want an absolutely no-nonsense, easy-to-read insight and explanation of what this faith is, where did it come from, how has it changed, and how do we know what we think we know about it. So this is really, I mean, I would argue this is a book ideal for somebody who is curious about Islam and has some degree of independence of mind. They actually value their independence of mind. They don't want to be sold a pack of porkies, and they don't want to labor in their reading.
Yeah. So, and I'm gonna address that in another question, but how have you gotten any feedback from people in the Muslim community on the book, and how are they reacting to it?
So I've had two polls, and I kind of expected the polls. Poll one is, thank you so much for writing a book that has shifted a huge burden off my shoulders. So I've had that message quite a few times, that I have essentially made life a whole lot easier for a bunch of people. And the second core message has been around, what you are doing is heresy. You are challenging centuries of tradition and so on and so forth, and it's wrong, and what you're doing should be stopped, type of stuff. And I mean, I can't answer for each person's individual journey, but I will say that this book has been in the making for more than 3 decades. And I've been thinking, debating, learning, relearning, unlearning, being challenged, being ridiculed, about my understanding of Muslims and Islam for a long time. And I mean, I'd like to hope that I poured out my heart and soul in this to produce something which, obviously isn't going to be perfect, but it's a damn good effort to make sense of this faith and where it's come from.
So, Sunni and Shia, when you talk about Islam, you're talking about in a general sense, to get people the basic concepts and the history and certain practices of the faith. But just like in the Christian church, there's the Catholic and Protestant division. I understand at least there's the Sunni and the Shia. Does any criticism that you might get come from one particular group or the other, or is it just kind of a universal response to your universal explanation of the faith?
So Sunnis outnumber Shia by about 7-1 in the world.
Okay.
And my book has focused more on Sunnism. Notwithstanding that, there's an awful lot of the book which has very significant implications also for Shiaism. And so to date, I have not detected any nuance in the feedback between members of the two sects. I have not been sensitive to it, perhaps, but I certainly haven't detected it. But I would imagine, frankly speaking, that the criticisms that I make of orthodoxy and Islamophobia will resonate with both sects. I can't see an obvious leaning in one way or the other.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and I think that's important to bring up. I like I said, I am not a scholar in Islam or Christianity, for that matter. But even though I practice Christianity, but I think people need to understand that, because that's part of when people get these sound bites in the news. And it depends in the United States whether you get it from Fox or whether you get it from CNN or MSNBC, how, they'll try to break down, the different sects of the faith and try to correlate, is one more violent than the other, and all that kind of stuff. So that's why I was just kind of curious as far as how people in the faith, how they're divided, and how they're receiving it. So, and I'm glad that you brought up the numbers that basically the Sunnis outnumber the Shias 7-1. So that helps out a lot. Why do you think when we discuss religion, right, that we have these polemic overtones? That if I came at you as a Christian, I'm not saying me per se, but just an example. I would come at you in a polemic sense that my faith is better than yours, right? And then there might be somebody, you or somebody else would come back at me and say, no, Islam is better, and yada, yada, this, that, other. Like it's a political debate. Why do you think we are, as human beings, we do that?
I think one of the unfortunate downsides of any identity is that if you buy too deeply into it, you end up losing sight of the most important identity, which is that of being human. And institutionalized religion, whether it's Christianity or Islam or Hinduism or whatever else, institutionalized religion with its own hierarchy of clerics or scholars and texts and methods, okay, that is often it's a wonderful place to remind everybody of the differences between us and them, which is a shame, because that really is not what being a better person demands. And I think there is a real problem here that institutionalized religion has, which is that far too much of the emphasis, implicitly perhaps, and subconsciously perhaps, is around the distinction between us and them, as opposed to recognizing that fundamentally we're all human beings. Now, I'm not saying religious identity is the only identity that's guilty of that. You do have, like, for instance, ethnicity. There are people out there who think that white people are distinct and superior. So you do have that as well, So it's not the only medium through which this discrimination is carried, but it's a very powerful one. And I think is quite unfortunate. And to the point that you made about, the counter response that I might take, which is that Islam is a superior religion, if I would adopt that position, I will say that I find it very interesting because the Quran carries a very simple message about this, which is that it's not my job or any Muslim's job or anybody's job to go around telling people what they should and shouldn't believe. Like, this is a point that's made again and again. If I have a duty, a religious duty, is to just share with people that this is what the religion is about, take it or leave it, end of story. And it's the only religion that I'm aware of that encourages religious pluralism. So the Jews and the Christians and the Muslims of the 7th century were encouraged to compete for God's favor, which is fantastic. It's like, hey, you guys, why don't you compete with the other religions just to be good? That is, to me, fantastic. Like, that is exactly what it should be about. And that's 7th century Arabia for you. Let's compete with Jewish people and Christian people so that we are better. We do better things, which is fantastic. And I think, there is an awful lot that institutionalized religion can be blamed for. And from the Muslim world, I point a lot of the fingers here at Islamic orthodoxy. I say, guys, you're kind of drawing some very sharp lines between people who have our religious identity versus those who have another religious identity, and in doing so, crushing the thing that's really important and the stuff that's really the source of our intrinsic value. We have value not because we are black or Jewish or gay or rich. We have value because we are humans. We're human beings. That is our source of value.
Yeah. Real quick before we close out, because I said I was going to double back to it. How does events like 9/11 and Israeli-Hamas conflict impact the lives of Muslims in places like the United States, Canada, and the UK? I mean, what is, we talked a little bit about the Islamophobia and all that, but what is the immediate impact? It's like, well, let me tell you this real quick story. So I was on a board that was an interfaith board, and we actually had a meeting scheduled the day 9/11 happened. And when we got to the meeting, the imam this was in Jackson, Mississippi, the imam had 2 cell phones. And he was going back and forth on the cell phones trying to respond. The rest of us are kind of watching on the TV and kind of discussing it. And we couldn't even engage with him because he was constantly on the phone. And then he just excused himself from the meeting. So the way I looked at what he was going through was an incredible amount of stress, an incredible amount of distress, about what happened, but also from getting feedback from people in his community. Is that kind of the general sense as far as impact that happens in the Muslim community when stuff like that happens?
Yes. So we get, particularly in the United States, all Muslims will get demonized by certain parts of society who have their own political agendas. So they will. So we will get demonized again and again and again when something happens on the world stage which has a Muslim identity to it. And I saw that in 9/11 in a very, very tough way, repeatedly being randomly set aside at airports for a security check, and the randomness of it was like so bovine that you didn't need to be Albert Einstein to see that this was not random. I just kind of fit the profile and that was the end of it. And you see it in all sorts of shapes and guises, from law enforcement to the banking system to job applications. And we just get hammered again and again, which is, I think it's so important that American Muslims and Muslims of other Western countries pick up the baton and say, look, this is just wrong. This is ridiculous. You just can't keep doing this. And to circus it and to push back. And it's a very difficult place to being a Muslim today. Like, one of my close friends is a leading lawyer in downtown Toronto, and he made the point to me very bluntly. He said, being a Muslim today is really tough work. We are always on the defensive. Yet, what's interesting is that you speak to any law enforcement agency in the United States, and they'll tell you that that American Muslims have a lower homicide per capita rate than do non-American Muslims. I mean, that's kind of interesting, maybe, but it's like, the facts never seem to matter. Richard III still has his statue up. He killed 3,000 people, innocent people in a day. That doesn't seem to matter. Let's put his statue up.
Yeah, I feel you on that, because we've got our ongoing struggles in the United States as far as dealing with these Confederate monuments, and being located in the South. That's a real issue that we've had to deal with for a number of years. And as people become more enlightened, those monuments and all those things get questioned, and I think that's healthy. And so this gets to my favorite part of the podcast, where the guest gets to plug things. So let me just say, your book, you accomplished what you wanted to accomplish as far as I was concerned. Your book is a very easy read, but it's very detailed. You can see the research that was put in there. And if people want to have a better understanding of something that you see on the news or hear on the news, and has been depicted one way or the other, this would be a good primer, I guess, for lack of a better term, to get an understanding. So tell people how folks can get the book, Being Muslim Today, Reclaiming the Faith from Orthodoxy and Islamophobia.
That book is available across bookstores nationwide. So all the online regulars as well as the independents will be able to source the book for you. And it's available on electronic format as well as physical format as well.
All right. So if people want to talk directly to you like I am, how can people get in touch with you, get you to show up at their university or whatever?
So I have a website, and the website has my contact details. So my website is saqibqureshi.com, which is my first and last name. It's an unusual spelling, so you might have to first search for Being Muslim Today, and from there take it forward. But it's saqibqureshi.com, and my contacts are there. So if anybody wanted to ping me, they can do it from there.
Well, Dr. Saqib Qureshi, thank you for coming on the podcast. I am extremely honored that you took the time out to talk about this book. I'm really honored that you wrote the book, and I'm glad that you followed through on all those thoughts that you've been dealing with for the last 30 years to go ahead and do it. And I'm really glad that your son asked the question, because that obviously provoked you to go ahead and do what you needed to do. So again, just thank you for doing that and being on the show.
That's so kind of you, Eric. Thank you so much.
All right, guys, and we're going to catch y'all on the other side. Hello, this is Eric Fleming, host of A Moment with Eric Fleming, and I need your help. We have an opportunity to cover the Democratic National Convention in Chicago this August, but I need to raise some money. So I need you to go to GoFundMe.com/help a moment with Eric Fleming broadcast from DNC 2024. That's GoFundMe.com, help a moment with Eric Fleming broadcast from DNC 2024. Thank you so much. All right, and we are back. And so now it is time for my next guest. His name is Timothy Bult. Timothy Bult was born in the mountains of British Columbia, Canada, to Dutch immigrants Roloff and Anike. He grew up skiing, camping, reading thousands of novels, in love with all the humanities and most of the sciences. After high school, he moved to Vancouver for college. He spent a year in France to obtain a master's in computer science, then returned for a master's in artificial intelligence research at the University of British Columbia. He did industrial AI work at Bell Northern Research in Ottawa for 3 years before returning to British Columbia yet again to work at McDonald Detweiler Associates in systems engineering around the world. After 27 years in Vancouver, visiting China, Israel, most of the United States, and pockets of the Middle East and Europe, he moved to Milwaukee. Timothy works at large companies managing global business transformations. While much of his writing is either classified or proprietary, he has published articles and books in various genres: science fiction, politics, AI, leadership, and romance. And we're going to talk about his book, Platform of Hope, Ideas Both Conservatives and Liberals Can Love. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor and privilege to have as a guest on this podcast, Timothy Bult. All right, Timothy Bult. How you doing, sir? You doing good?
Excellent. Delightful to meet you, Eric. Looking forward to this.
Yeah, well, I was intrigued. I saw a book called Platform of Hope, Ideas for Both Conservatives and Liberals Can Love. And I said, this ought to be interesting in this time to see how this individual decided to do that. So I was really, really thrilled that you accepted my invitation to come on. So what I like to do to kind of get things started is to throw a quote at the guests. So this is your quote. I'm trying to find solutions that don't get labeled liberal or conservative and can simply stand as American. I'm not naively saying there are no serious differences in American opinion, but I am saying there's room for common ground. What does that quote mean to you?
Clearly, our politics is increasingly polarized. People are angry at each other. There's so much hatred. And extremists on both parties in America are putting forward policies that they say are the answer to the problems that clearly the other side hates and will not sign up for. And so there is this impression in America that we can't find common ground, that it's almost impossible to pass a law that people on both sides would respect. And I say that's an impression because if you dig and if you try, I find that for most of the issues that we face, there is a chance to find bipartisan legislation, things that the politicians and certainly Americans as a whole can agree to as a majority. You know, for almost any issue that we pick. Now, I had real challenge with some of the issues I addressed in the book, trying to find something that I really believed both sides could like. And of course, the extremists on either side will never agree with each other on anything. But the more I worked on the book and I continue to try to refine it in response to feedback, the more I believe that on most of our issues, it is possible. And I think the main evidence of that is if you look at the facts, every year there are on the order of 20 major bills that are signed with support from both sides. They don't get as much press as all the disagreement because bad news makes more interesting news. And, you know, during Biden's administration with a very hostile Republican House, still there are important pieces of legislation that did get through, including with support from both sides. So I just think it behooves us, any politician should be trying to reach across the aisle and do bipartisan stuff. And I think voters should reward politicians that make stuff happen as opposed to the extremists.
Yeah. So Joseph Joubert said that the aim of argument or of discussion should not be victory, but progress. Would you say that is the general premise of your book?
That's a brilliant quotation, and I want to capture that and include it in my next version. I like that.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. So what motivated you to write this book? Why did you feel that at this time that you decided, okay, my voice needs to be heard on this particular subject?
So I've always been interested in politics, and I moved to the U.S. from Canada about 10 years ago. And it was eye-opening. I had traveled in the U.S. before, but coming here first with a green card and as of a couple of months ago as a citizen, I've been continually assaulted by the differences between American and Canadian politics. I used to think they were kind of similar, but the polarization just got to me, and it bothered me over the years. And the book was sparked in the run-up to the last election, where I felt, with all the election ads and the debates, that people were talking past each other, and the level of anger was disconcerting to me. And so it was my thought that to the extent that I could, by publishing something, influence that election, I would get the book out before the election to at least, have a chance of affecting things and pushing for more reasonable dialogue and encouraging voters to vote for people that would, as you said, make progress as opposed to victory.
So what fascinated you about American politics? Because you said in the book that you kind of blame your interest in politics in a sense on your Dutch heritage, that there's no argument a Dutch person, I'm paraphrasing, but there's no argument a Dutch person wouldn't interject in. But why American politics? What fascinates you about how we do things here?
I mean, I love some of the principles of American policy, the principle of freedom, the principle of, give people the freedom to do what they want, and you'll get a successful society, as opposed to controlling them. The principles of freedom of speech that the country was founded on, for example, it gets us into trouble. There's, in a sense, almost too much freedom. Like the Supreme Court recently has been basically saying anybody is free to have any gun. and that's a level of freedom that outside the United States, most countries see as shocking or too much. But it's really interesting to see what are the limits on freedom that a government should or might put in. What else do I find fascinating? The Americans are so good at so many things. We're the best in the world at a lot of stuff, and so bad at other things. The dichotomy, the range of experience that we have. We're one of the richest countries in the world, but we still have poverty and kids that can't get educated. I mean, that's just seen as crazy by Europeans. And yet we're incredibly wealthy because we give companies the freedom to grow and to try things. So yeah, it's that weird mix that fascinates me.
Yeah, and I definitely understand that. Because here the key word in that answer was dichotomy. Right. And as an African American, and we'll get into that because you addressed that in the book. But, being African American I've always said was a dichotomy, because as an American citizen, you have love for this country. You root for this country in anything. You want to see this country succeed. But then at the same time, there are some issues that, as an African American, that I have to deal with because of this country, and historically the wealth of this country was built on the backs of my ancestors, and I and several others are not getting the full benefit, or we think we're not getting the full benefit of it. So yeah, dichotomy is a very, very important word in part of the American experience. So let's address some of the suggestions you make in the book. By the way, you're not running for president of the United States. Usually people who run for president of the United States write these kind of books. So I want to make it clear, Mr. Bolt's not going to be on the ballot. But he took it upon himself to address some issues. So we're going to start off with some easy issues. I say easy.
Thank you.
And then work our way up to some of the controversial ones as time allows. On the issue of paper currency, for example, you say eliminate it altogether. How will eliminating paper currency, or you put it in the book, cash, how will that help American society?
It's a little bit of a personal hobby horse of mine, and I'm not sure it's one of the biggest issues. I tackle much bigger issues in the book. However, cash makes theft easier. You know, you might mug somebody to get their cash. If you know they don't have any, it's tougher. A lot of crime has to deal with cash. You see it on cop shows all the time about, suitcases of $100 bills. I'm not saying cash is financial crime is eliminated. They'll find other ways. But I think a cashless society allows for some crime reduction.
Yeah, and you made you were using as an example in that particular chapter. You were talking about how India, which is one of the biggest countries in the world, is a lot more advanced than we are as far as having a paperless or cashless society as far as economics go. And so you think that the United States, being the country that it is, could function and probably exceed what India has done as far as making it more standard practice not to use paper money.
Right.
Okay. On the issue of daylight savings time, you suggest that we stop that practice to lower business costs and create less suffering for people. Kind of explain that.
Well known, there's a surge of traffic accidents with every switch of time, twice a year. It was invented at a time when energy costs to keep streets lit was a big deal. That's peanuts now. Every time you lose an hour, it's a bit of extra stress. You have to get up an hour earlier every Monday. Again, it's not one of the biggest issues of our time, but it's kind of an annoyance. And one of the annoying things is that the vast majority of Americans want to get rid of it. Like if there's survey after survey, it's bipartisan. People are willing, and they're arguing about the details, and it just falls off the legislative radar every time. We got close in the last legislative session. It's easy to say there are bigger fish to fry in Congress, so it doesn't have to be a priority. But I think it would be an easy win for a bipartisan issue at some point to put it to bed.
Yeah, and growing up in Illinois, it was kind of, and my mom was from Indianapolis, Indiana, so it was a big deal locally when Indiana said, "You know what, we're not doing this. We're not going back and forth. It's just, we already have a state with 2 different time zones as it is." And so they just said, "No, we're not going to do that." And a historical fact, I don't know if you're aware of this, the only reason why Indiana falls into the 2 time zone region is because of Notre Dame football.
Oh, really? I did not know that.
They wanted Notre Dame football to be at the same time zone as the New York Press. So, they would update those games because the West Coast teams always get, it's hard for their kids to get recognized, for awards and get the media attention. At that time, all the media attention was in New York City. So it was like they had, even though Chicago was right there, it was still an hour later than New York. And so they wanted to get Notre Dame football on the Eastern time slot. And so that's why the states got that little curve fall into the Eastern time zone. All right, now let's get into some media issues. On abortion, you make the case that life starts as it ends with brain activity. Why is that important in the abortion discussion for you?
Thanks for tackling a tough one. This is the toughest issue in the book. Just a quick story that I had a colleague who heard I was an author and immediately went out and bought a couple of my books. And I heard later, she doesn't talk to me anymore. She just stopped at the abortion chapter and threw the book down and just didn't pick it up again. She's a devoted pro-lifer who thinks, life starts at conception and you should protect the baby from that moment onward. So you're not going to reach some people regardless of what you try. But in the spirit of, trying to find something that that the majority of Americans can support, the majority of Americans believe that abortion should be available as a woman's choice in the first trimester, and that it should get tougher after that. It's a fuzzy thing. Most Americans don't support abortion at 9 months, and they're very rare anyway. I mean, they hardly ever happen, even where it's allowed. But that's kind of the majority view. It just struck me when I was looking for this solution that, we have pretty clear legal definitions. There's not a lot of controversy about the end of life. There have been some cases where people, heart's beating, but the brain stops, and some extremists want to keep that heart beating even though there's no brain left. But the Supreme Court made its rulings and decided that brain death was the end of life. It seems symmetrical and kind of clean to say, hey, if there's no brain at the very beginning, then it's not really a human being, a soul, right? It's hard to imagine a soul that's worth preserving if there's no brain, if there's no mind. And it just happens to be that the brain turns on at 13 weeks, right after the first trimester. So that, some people call it a baby at 2 weeks when it's a bunch of cells, right? But I can respect and understand, and I think a majority of Americans would acknowledge that there is a human life if there's a brain that has brain waves, that baby, that fetus is starting to think. So I think that might be a reasonable time to put a cutoff. To say, okay, after that point, maybe there are two lives then. There's the baby's life and the mother's life, and you might have horrible situations where you have to weigh one against the other. But at least it's, worth having a discussion about one life versus the other. Before 13 weeks, in my view, I think it's reasonable to say there is no human soul worth protecting. So it's partly trying to find a compromise and partly a matter of principle.
Yeah, and I admit in my political career that I wavered on the issue because when I first got started as an activist, I was pro-choice all the way. I would give speeches and say all they are is pro-fetus, and they don't care about the life once the child is born, especially those of color, right? And when I became a father, I got a little more, because I went through that process with my wife at the time, and to actually be there when my child was born, it kind of I did, like most people, when you get older, you get a little more conservative about it. But I wasn't to the point where I didn't think a woman had a right to choose. But I did, in my political position, try to stick to the letter Roe v. Wade. So any bill that came up that was like, well, the government's going to spend X amount of dollars, I voted against that. And my dichotomy on that issue was so weird that one year I got an award from the pro-life folks and from the ACLU. So, it's a tough issue. I say that as a tough issue. And now without the federal protection Roe v. Wade, I'm like, here we go with this crazy mess. Having served as a state legislator and being around the extremists, the Roe v. Wade at least was the cushion. And now that that's been eliminated and you allow the states to do stuff, what we're finding is that it's tougher for people. And I noticed that you deliberately put that. I don't know what draft you sent your friend, but in the final copy, you made that the last chapter because you said it's a tough issue, and it is. But I appreciate how you were able to, you made an effort to create a compromise point. And I think most people would fall in line with that. But let's go on. On voting rights, you support a universal ID system and an independent agency to handle redistricting. Why is that important for election integrity?
So it's two separate issues. The second one on an independent agency, I know that requires constitutional amendments, and that's really hard to get to. But it shocks me that there's gerrymandering in this country. That the representative boundaries are twisted by both parties, most recently primarily by the Republicans, to basically get more vote or more House seats for the party that gets to do it. That seems crazy to non-Americans. Canada has an independent elections agency. It's kind of like the Food and Drug Administration in the U.S. It's not political. It's Elections Canada. And they decide the boundaries of every riding. There is no gerrymander. There is no, this party is better off here than this party because of how the boundaries were set. That's really hard to change. Sure, the vast majority of Americans would rather have a fair system. That one's really hard to implement because it's written into the Constitution how we organize our election boundaries. But it would just be better all around, less corrupt. The ID system is politically challenging, and I expect progressives and Democrats would push back on, more ID requirements as opposed to less. There are conservatives who genuinely believe that there are fraudulent votes cast by undocumented immigrants and maybe multiple voting. The facts are that there isn't, but there is certainly a lot of conservatives who believe sincerely that there are fraudulent votes. It would help with other things like being able to distribute aid checks like was done during the pandemic. Those checks didn't reach people because we don't know who they are. We don't have ID. If you first do like India did and make sure everybody in the country has ID, like every person has ID that identifies that they are indeed an American, and then make that ID a requirement to vote, that should satisfy both. For one, it'll help get the vote out. It'll allow, hey, if you need that ID to vote, both parties should be perfectly comfortable with online voting, ballot boxes, whatever it takes to get the vote out.
Yeah. I know you kind of think, well, I'm trying to throw out some ideas, but you're not that far off as far as where we are. First thing I want to address is the fact that you don't have to do anything with the Constitution as far as dealing with the redistricting, because all the Constitution basically says is that it's an equal proportion, right? As far as all the Constitution does is set the number. So if there's going to be 435 representatives, divide that by
the state government.
Yeah, the state government has to do it, but the state government is not constitutional as far as, I mean, they could do it if they decide they want to put that on a ballot for an amendment, they can.
Right.
But really the state legislature, all 50 state legislatures can just say, yeah, because some states have already done that. I think Michigan is one of, I know there's one key battleground state that does that. And then I think California does it. I've got to go back and check. But there are some states that have independent commissions already. And, it is what it is. But what was happening is that in some of those states, if the conservatives took over, they were trying to get rid of that.
Right.
And so that's been the battle with that. As far as the ID goes, our biggest argument as far as African Americans was that it was considered a poll tax because there were a lot of people that didn't drive or were elderly and they didn't have a license, at least an updated one. And so we felt, well, these people got to pay whatever the fee is just so they could go vote. So Mississippi, when all the states were being sued that passed voter ID bills, Mississippi was the only state that wasn't sued. And the reason why was because the Secretary of State compromised with those of us who were saying, yeah, that's not fair, and said, okay, well, if we're going to put in the legislation that we'll put in money, if y'all put money in the Secretary of State's budget, we'll put in there that each county clerk would get money to create IDs so people can vote. If they don't have a driver's license, they can just come to the county clerk's office and we'll provide that for free. But he basically said, I got to give these county clerks money so they can do that. So that happened. And because of that provision, we were like the first state that was like saying, well, if you don't have an ID, we'll give you one so you can go vote. And so that's how Mississippi. And then the other Mississippi nugget of that was I was serving on the transportation committee and we were voting against the federal provision for real ID. And they had threatened us and said, if y'all don't pass that, then any state that doesn't pass it, then you would have to use a passport instead of your driver's license to get on a plane. So being on the committee, I went and got a passport, right? But what ended up happening was Thad Cochran, who was over appropriations, kind of convinced the federal government, okay, well, if you want to have a real ID and we want to make this work, let's make Mississippi the model driver's license. So Mississippi became the pilot state as far as the technology for real ID. And so now it was like we went from Mississippians would have to use a passport to now it's like the Mississippi driver's license was the model of what information needs to go in and all that kind of stuff. So the technology is there now for people, if they have a driver's license, to be able to, go not only to the airport, but in Georgia, they've taken that technology. And if you give your driver's license to the, what am I trying to say? If you give your driver's license to the voter register, the voting official, they have a device where they stick that in there, your license in there, and then you get it'll print out information, so it automatically give that person the right ballot based on the information that's on the ID. Right. So you're not too far off on that. But anyway, let's get off of that for a minute, because I wanted to get on a couple of things because we're running short on time. On racism, you say a solution is to prioritize equality of education. How do you think that will help African Americans, and how soon do you think it will make an impact?
As I say in the chapter, I think it's the most important factor in improving the tilted playing field. I do believe there's a tilted playing field. I mean, the statistics are just crazy on the economic difference between Black and white Americans. And I think it traces to just history. Most of the difference statistically in economic success of African Americans compared to white correlates with the difference in education. Blacks don't get as high a quality education on average as whites, and that dramatically affects what you can do later in your life. Of course, I'd like in a nice short book. My book is not that long. I wanted it to be pithy and to the point. There are probably 1,000 things that need to be done to really level the playing field in the U.S. 100 years from now, you won't see economic or social or racist gaps in America, I hope and believe. So there are a lot of things that need to be done, but trying to find the most important, I think it's education. And I mean primarily K-12 education. A Black person who manages to get to Harvard one way or another is going to do as well economically as a white person that made it to Harvard. Michelle Obama worked her ass off. I read her book. It was, I really enjoyed that biography. But, the intense pressure and work that she went through to get to Harvard, led her to a very successful life. A kid that grows up in a shitty school zone where they don't even teach science beyond grade, that kid isn't going to become a computer scientist very easily. And the difference between the worst school in the U.S. and the best school is just, it's like this. I came to a huge difference. I came here from Canada. In Canada, there are good schools and bad schools. The difference from the worst school to the best school is peanuts. Because the funding formula in Canada is much more equal. The school funding doesn't come from your local school board, your local property taxes. It's basically statewide.
Yeah. The history.
But you know what?
Go ahead.
As I said, one thing I really wanted to get out of the podcast, I wanted to get your opinion. Like, that was my view. I'm an educated white guy. I would really like to hear from you. What do you think is the most important thing that government could do to overcome that history? Well,
I'll say this because there's another question that directly correlates with that. But you're not far off the track, and I like the way that you brought up, conservative Black writers like Thomas Sowell and McWhorter about their emphasis on education, why it's important. If you look at the history of the United States, especially Reconstruction, when Black people started getting political offices, especially in the South, if you notice the constitutions in those southern states, they made sure that education, public education, was a right. And even when in Mississippi, when they were dealing with education issues, and I forget I think the referendum was about funding, for public education and all that. Nobody, even in the 1890 Constitution, when they changed it back to try to limit Black voters and the rights of Black people, they did not take out the provision that education is a right. And so it's not too far off of the thought that in the black community that education is key. And side note, Michelle Obama and I are basically about the same age. We were in high school at the same time in Chicago. So I definitely understand exactly what she went through. She went to a pretty good high school. I went to a pretty good high school in the city. So that gave us an advantage over some other kids, even in our own city. So education is a key component, but I want to get into this other discussion since you asked about government. You state that reparations has to overcome some difficult criteria in its design. Elaborate on those criteria, and in your opinion, can those criteria be met?
I think it's really challenging. If you look at morally at how much negative impact the history of this country has had on black people, the moral cost of reparations would be enormous. So much that I think, frankly, politically, it just couldn't happen. So
go ahead.
It has to be acceptable to a majority of Americans for it to happen. And just the bill, as I said, the bill would be too high for people to accept, even if they acknowledge that it would be fair.
Yeah, I'm a proponent of reparations, but I think we, to try to couch it, what I always say, to try to couch it as the Dave Chappelle skit, where everybody got a check. You know what I'm saying? I think that's not really feasible because it'll never be enough, right? I know in Mississippi we were dealing with a lawsuit to try to make sure that the historically black colleges were funded, and when they reached the settlement, there was a picture of the chairman of the college board and the attorney general for the state high-fiving each other, and the settlement was close to $1 billion. And I made the statement that if two white guys are high-fiving giving black folks $1 billion, we didn't ask for enough. We didn't ask for enough money. If we do it, if we're strictly talking about a check, that might not be feasible. Well, one of the things, I think we need to explore is, programs like you made the suggestion about education funding, for example, from a federal standpoint. And the last two administrations, I'm not a big fan of Donald Trump. Everybody in the podcast knows that. But his administration and then Biden doubled down on the commitment and put more money into HBCUs, right? And then, so stuff like that, dealing with the housing situation. I think the housing situation is the most important because, and you mentioned it in a book about wealth, that was a revelation to you. There's a book I would suggest, 15 cents on the dollar, by Story and Read, that will help you and help listeners, of course, understand the history and the data behind the wealth gap. But one of the things it highlights, and I really like that, is the housing issue. Because if the more homeowners you have in the black community, the more wealth that blacks will have, and wealth in a capitalistic society is power. So I think that's, outside of education, building wealth is the other key to demand respect and all that. So, all right, we've gone over a little bit. So that proves that we don't have the time to discuss each issue you cover in the book. Plus, I want people to buy the book for themselves. So let's conclude it like this. What should people take away from this book once they buy it and read it?
Sorry, could you repeat the question? I cut out for a second.
Okay. What do you want people to take away from this book?
I would like them to have optimism that there really are solutions to all the problems we have in America, that the best way to reach them is to think about what the other side's concerns are and try to find common ground. I think that common ground really does exist for most issues. And we shouldn't listen to the extremist politicians that refuse to compromise and refuse to try to find bipartisan legislation.
Yeah. And as somebody that was a legislator, I greatly appreciate that, because the reality is, and you mentioned it earlier, that a lot of legislation gets passed, especially in the state level. A lot of legislation gets passed with bipartisan support, but that doesn't make the news. Not necessarily, now unless it was a big issue, and then it's a surprise to the media that the majority of the legislators agreed on this particular issue. But, you know, on an everyday basis, every year in state legislatures, because unlike the federal government, the state legislature has to approve a budget. Each state has to approve a budget, or else they can't leave the building, right? Technically, they can't get out of session. So there's always that, and then there's a lot of issues that members agree on. There may be debate on it, but you know, you tend to reach common ground more commonly than others. So I appreciate anybody that wants to try to get to that point of common ground, because that's the essence of American politics to me. So how can people get a copy of Platform of Hope, Ideas Both Conservatives and Liberals Can Love? And how can people reach you if they want you to come on their show or give lectures or whatever the case may be?
You can find links on my website if you Google Timothy Bult, B-U-L-T. I've got a website with the links to Amazon. My books are available in a few other places, but the easiest is to go to Amazon and find either the electronic or the paperback.
All right. Well, Timothy Bult, it was an honor not only to meet you, but to get you on the podcast. I am very, very grateful that you took the time and the research to try to come up with a platform of hope. And I think that the spirit that you have put out there, if more people, especially those people in leadership, adopt that spirit, I think we can navigate from this tumultuous time that we're living in. So again, I thank you for writing the book, and I thank you for coming on the podcast.
It has been a great pleasure, Eric. Thank you very much.
All right, guys, and we're going to catch y'all on the other side. All right, and we are back. So I want to thank Dr. Qureshi and Mr. Bult for coming on the podcast, and please go and get their books, Being Muslim Today and Platform of Hope. Get those books and read them for yourself. The interviews scratch the surface about how in depth those books are, even, you know, and they're not long reads, but they're very substantial. And like most of the guests, as you've heard me say before, these books are very easy reads. They're not too intellectual, not too academic, I guess would be even a better word. You can relate to what these people are saying. And you know, so go out and support them in that endeavor. And speaking about support, Guys, I need y'all's help now. I've been trying to get folks to subscribe to the Patreon. Again, it's only $1 a month. And I need y'all to do that. And more immediately, I need y'all to help me raise this money. We've got an awesome opportunity to cover the convention in Chicago in August. I've been filling out my paperwork as far as the Secret Service stuff and the hotel and all that. But we still are trying to raise some money. And I appreciate those of you who have already donated. You should have already got your thank you emails from me. But I need y'all to come on now. I know y'all are listening to the podcast. I know y'all paying attention to what's going on. And especially with the drama that is developing with the Democratic Party as far as whether Biden should stay on the ticket or not, all that's going to be decided at the convention. And your voice, the podcast of our time, has been invited to be there, whatever happens, whether it's, status quo, Biden, Harris, all the way to November, or there's going to be a dramatic change. We've been invited to be there. So I need y'all's help. I need y'all to come on and make this happen. So with that appeal, again, you can go to the GoFundMe website or the app, or to make it easy to cover all those bases, whether it's Patreon or the GoFundMe campaign. Go to www.momenteric.com. And you can access all of that and keep track of all of the episodes that we've been able to do. So thank y'all for listening. Appreciate y'all's support. Until next time.